I'd like to continue now with Mr. No for his 5 minutes. Mr. No, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, and members of the committee. Being a journalist from Portland, Oregon, I know domestic terrorism well. Since 2016, I've witnessed how violent extremists from Antifa and others have made political violence on the streets of my home city, banal. Local politicians turned a blind eye to the violence because they believed the extremism was a justified response to the surprise election win of Donald Trump. Local fellow journalists did the same in downplaying Antifa's violent extremism. Today, I ask that you don't do the same. From 2016 through 2019, Portland and the surrounding area suffered dozens of violent protests, mass street brawls, and riots that resulted in serious bodily injuries, arson attacks, and property destruction. By 2020, Antifa exploited the anger around the death of George Floyd and others to launch an unprecedented attempted insurrection in Portland. For more than 120 recurring days, Antifa carried out nightly riots targeting federal, county, and private property. They developed a riot apparatus that included streams of funding for accommodation, travel, riot gear, and weapons. This resulted in a murder, hundreds of arson attacks, mass injuries, and mass property destruction. To put that into context for those here today, similar actions that occurred at the Capitol Hill riot on the 6th of January 2021 were repeated every night, months on end in the Pacific Northwest. In Seattle, Antifa and far-left extremists seized 6 blocks of city territory that they said was autonomous. It resulted in 6 shootings and 2 murders over a period of 3 weeks. In July 2020, then DHS Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli reported to Congress at a Senate hearing that at least 277 injuries have been inflicted on about 140 federal agents protecting the Mark O. Hatfield U.S. Courthouse in Portland. With my own eyes, I witnessed black-clad, masked militants setting fires to buildings occupied by people. The Antifa came armed with homemade IEDs, guns, and knives. They blinded their targets with powerful lasers before throwing projectiles like rocks, glass, and frozen water bottles. Some of them even brought electric power tools to cut apart the fencing that was set up to protect the courthouse. Andrew Faulkner, one of the few federal suspects indicted over rioting charges, allegedly possessed pipe bomb components and a machete at the time of his arrest. The following month, a self-described Antifa member hunted down a Trump supporter in downtown and shot him dead point blank before fleeing out of state and being killed by federal authorities the following week. He left behind a trail of posts on his social media indicating his desire for an armed conflict with the state, which he viewed as fascist. I'm encouraged today to see lawmakers discussing the important subject of domestic terrorism, but I'm concerned that our representatives are increasingly viewing this through a partisan lens. This puts all Americans at risk. Those speaking before and after me can illuminate and educate us on far-right terrorism, a threat extremely well tracked by government agencies, nonprofits, and journalists. Much less understood is the terrorism threat from the far left, particularly Antifa. Far-left terrorism isn't new in the US. It has a long history in the second half of the 20th century, where groups like the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, and the May 19 Communist Organization carried out bombings, robberies, and jailbreaks in the name of anti-racism. Antifa are continuing that legacy today and use the cloak of anti-fascism to shield themselves from criticism and to fool well-meaning people into becoming allies. In September 2020, FBI Director Chris Wray told lawmakers that Antifa is real and that the FBI investigates the threat coming from violent anarchist extremists who identify with Antifa. We should heed his warnings. Domestic terrorism is not partisan. Both the far left and the far right seek to delegitimize and destabilize the republic. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Again, let me indicate that this hearing is interwoven with white racism and white nationalism, the fomenting of white Nazism, which is generated into violence. It includes, of course, the obvious fact of January 6th. And so let me Mr. Dermott, I'm going to come to you for the first question, let me just, again, show a picture that has a police officer down and surrounded by the terrorists on January 6th.
Mr. No, two of the witnesses testifying today did not even mention Antifa in their written testimony, which is shocking, actually, given the amount of violence that Antifa has wrought over the past several years. Mr. No, if we don't talk about Antifa, is Antifa going away?
No, they're not going away. Since the election night, for example, in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, where I'm from, the National Guard was activated by the governor because dozens, or actually more than 100 masked militants marauded through downtown, destroying property. They vandalized a church that provides charity services on Inauguration Day in Portland. To protest the inauguration of Biden. Antifa destroyed the headquarters of the Democrat Party. So this perception that they only attacked things on the right is wrong. They attack anything that they view as American. So that includes democratic institutions, buildings that represent the rule of law.
So, and Mr. No, one of your co-panelists has said of Antifa that, quote, though often violent, they do not yet use terrorist tactics or acts, close quote. Based on what you've seen firsthand, do you agree with that statement?
So I think the issue with the lack of understanding of Antifa's violence comes from the fact that there's not a lot of mainstream media coverage of it. A lot of people, lawmakers in DC, will get their media coverage from the New York Times or Washington Post. And sometimes those publications will send parachute journalists into the Pacific Northwest, but by and large, they don't have somebody on the ground every day as the riots were breaking out, let's say in Portland, or when Chaz, the autonomous zone in Seattle. And this is areas where people were bringing with them homemade explosives in their backpacks and distributing them to others to throw at the federal courthouse. Bringing in electric tools to cut into the fence so that they could set the building on fire. They did set the exterior on fire multiple times. And it's not just law enforcement that's inside. There's also civilian people who are working as staff who've had to flee for their lives as they did at the Justice Center. So I think these acts, because they're targeted on facilities that have civilians inside, I think based on my understanding of the laws, these do count as terrorist acts, but they're not being reported as such or perceived as such for political reasons.
One of your co-panelists has also said that Antifa's organizing principle is to confront the alt-right. Do you agree with that statement, and can you please explain?
That statement in itself is true, but the label of who they call alt-right or fascist applies very broadly. So yes, it will include people who are actually on the far right, but it will also include people who are patriotic, who are holding an American flag that they will also assault and beat. Any and all law enforcement, anybody who defends the institutions of this country, they view as people who are fascistic in one way or another. I mean, if you dive into their ideology, you look at the literature that they disseminate at their protests and riots and when they establish autonomous zones, you'll see that they're calling for the overthrow of the American government. So this whole label of anti-fascist that they're using is just essentially marketing and branding to mask what is a very extremist, radical agenda to destabilize the republic.
Another comment that was tweeted out by one of your co-panelists said, quote, there are no laws defining domestic terrorism in the USA, close quote. Is that correct, Mr. No? Are there no laws defining domestic terrorism in the US?
There are laws on the book. I think the problem right now is that the investigators are being pressured one way or another to pursue things for political reasons. I'm not here to say that there's no threat coming from the far right. That's not my area of expertise. I defer to those who have been giving testimony today. I think, at the beginning we heard this 75% of the deaths from domestic terrorist attacks have come from the far right. Well, does that mean that the other 25% doesn't deserve attention? I don't think so. It's about keeping all American states, and that includes investigating all extremist ideologies.
Would you agree that during the left-wing extremist violence last summer, there were some prominent elected officials, Democrats for the most part, and much of the mainstream media that not only downplayed what was going on, but in many cases were apologists for that violence that we saw on in America's cities, on America's streets last summer? And could you tell us what you observed with your own two eyes with respect to that?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so the violence that occurred in Portland, which I know best, resulted in hundreds of injuries to federal and local law enforcement. And I was shocked to see that the response from the local city council to the mayor and the senators and the governor were to describe those officers as an occupying force, as Trump's Gestapo, as secret police. That type of rhetoric extremely inflamed the situation and brought in and encouraged other well-meaning protesters to come in, which unfortunately those people were then exploited and used as human shields. So at the riots, particularly in July, when rioters in Antifa and other extremist groups were trying to burn down the federal courthouse, they actually had the peaceful protesters up at the front. So the Wall of Moms, Wall of Vets, and Wall of Dads, they put these people at the very front so that law enforcement would be slow or hesitant to use tear gas or crowd control. And then from the back, the rioters had a whole brigade of people using really powerful lasers that can cause permanent eye damage. They would center it on their targets and then throw glass, rocks, concrete, and other projectiles to injure these officers. And the response over and over from the media was to call these protests mostly peaceful, to the point it became a meme. It seemed like they were living in an alternate reality and not witnessing what was happening and not seeing the actual injuries that were occurring. But I think the most egregious acts that were done in the later months as the riots went on in Portland was the targeting of police stations by rioters who set fires to these facilities when police officers were inside doing work and when civilian staff were doing work inside. And again, this did not get the condemnation that it needed. And in fact, people frequently in positions of power were calling these racial justice protests, which was obfuscating what I view as in the words of the Antifa themselves, an agenda for terroristic actions to intimidate the public.
And I asked over and over again, give me an example of a Black extremist organization. Tell me about one. And I know earlier in this hearing, an organization was mentioned that I think is ludicrous to be considered a terrorist organization, and that's the Black Hebrew Israelites. But Madam Chair, I want to ask the committee for something. I would like to have a classified briefing so that the FBI can come in and tell us about Black terrorists, Black extremist organizations, because I am not aware of one.
Mr. No, in light of the damage done by the violent protests last summer, where is the damage to inner city and minority businesses, communities, trying to find the American way, trying to make a living? Where has this damage been mostly done, Mr. No?
So in Portland, there's one example that stands out a lot. There was a Black-owned cafe, Heroes Cafe, in Southwest Portland. And the business has photographs of first responders and law enforcement, and some of the proceeds are donated to some pro-law enforcement organizations. That business got put on a list by one of the Antifa groups in Portland. And then after the statue of Abraham Lincoln was toppled last autumn, that same night, somebody shot through this business several times, and someone using a melee weapon smashed up some windows. So this is like the real on the ground damage of what the campaign of terrorism does. And they do it in an organized manner under groups on Twitter, on social media. And, you know, we've been naming anecdotes left and right of mass shootings and killings that have happened in the US perpetrated by the far right. I just want to set for the record that in August of 2019, after the shooting in El Paso, Texas, in Dayton, Ohio, there was a far left extremist who killed 9 people and injured 27 others. In his social media before it was taken down, he showed his affiliation for Antifa. Somebody had recognized him when he had gone to Antifa protests previously. In January, the FBI recently arrested a suspect in Florida who had gone to Syria, and on his social media has a long history of posts in support of espousing support for Antifa. So I hope that, you know, with lawmakers, we can entrust you to move beyond the which side is worse than the other and start talking about how do we come up with laws to keep all
Gentleman's
Americans
time
safe.
has expired. Thank you. Gentleman from Ohio, the ranking member, Mr. Jordan, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. No, I want to go right to your testimony. In the middle of your testimony, you said actions that occurred at the Capitol on January 6, 2021 were repeated every night, and you emphasize every night, months on end in the Pacific Northwest. And then you define those actions. Antifa carried out nightly riots targeting federal, county, and private property. They developed a riot apparatus that included streams of funding for accommodation, travel, riot gear, and weapons. This all resulted in murder, hundreds of arson attacks, mass injuries, and mass property destruction. How many days in a row did all that take place in your hometown of Portland?
Consecutively, approximately 120 days.
120 days. So what people on Capitol Hill lived through one day, you and your neighbors and people in Portland, Oregon lived through for 120 days straight. Is that accurate?
That's correct, sir.
120 days straight. And yet I don't remember the Democrats condemning what was going on in Portland. That's the part. A little earlier, we had the chairwoman of the committee say that she abhors violence. But last summer, when the Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer of this country, was in front of this committee and asked the Democrats, why won't you condemn the violence going on in Portland and other big cities? Complete silence from the Democrats. So, Mr. No, I don't know if you're Republican or Democrat. I don't know what your party affiliation is, if any. But what I do know is you're consistent. You're condemning all political violence. Is that right?
That's right, sir.
Whether it happened on January 6th or whether it happened in the summer of 2020, right?
That's right.
Whether it happened at the Capitol of the United States or whether it happens in your hometown, it is wrong. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you know firsthand what it's like, right? You've lived it. I think you said in the opening paragraph, you said, I know domestic terrorism well. Can you tell us what happened to you back in 2019?
Yes. I was hesitant to share this again, but in 2019, while working as a journalist covering one of the many protests turned riots that were involving Antifa and their other far left allies, they targeted me and beat me severely. Mass militants punched me repeatedly on the head and the face, and I ended up in the hospital with a brain bleed, and I nearly died from that.
And they targeted you because...
Ever since then...
Excuse me, I'm sorry. They targeted you...
Ever since then, they've continued to escalate death threats against me. Yeah, I've had to leave my home.
And they targeted you because you had the courage as a journalist to accurately portray what they were doing and what kind of tactics they engaged in and the harm and violence that they caused. Is that right?
That's what I believe, yes.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, look, we need consistency. We need to condemn all violence. Republicans condemn the violence that took place on the 6th. We condemn the violence that took place for 120 straight days in Portland when Antifa was laying siege to the federal building. While that was happening, we had our colleagues talk about they needed more unrest in the streets. At the very time unrest was happening in the streets, we had our colleagues say that the organization that tried to end your life and that for 120 days had violence happening every single day in Portland, that organization was a myth. Look, this is so important. I appreciate Mr. No's willingness to talk about the consistency that is needed from everyone, from both sides of the aisle, to address this problem and get violence out of our political process.
It's how the laws can be focused so that it really goes after terrorists and not people who are carrying out civil unrest or civil disobedience. I mean, in some definitions, based on what Mr. No said today, we would have to have, arrested just about everyone who, violently protested at it or violently rioted at a Super Bowl party or a state championship. The definition needs to meet the tactics. For whatever you want to say about what happened in Portland, in Seattle, in Kenosha, those were not acts of terrorism. They were not domestic terrorists. They were acts of civil disobedience and protest. We've seen equal vigor at Super Bowl protests. We've seen fire and fights, and I'm from Philadelphia. But what we saw on the 6th of January was literally an organized attempt, which was backed by 40,000 protesters and as many as 3,000 to 5,000, according to the Park Service's estimates, smashing in to destroy your building to stop the democratic process, to literally stop democracy in its tracks. They were willing to kill.
75% of all murders from domestic terrorism have been the result of right-wing extremists. Mr. No, would you give me the leaders of the Antifa movement? What are their names, please?
If you read any of my reports, you would know that there are no single leaders. They're organized into autonomous cells that are connected by
Thank you very much,
networks.
Mr. No. So in fact, as the FBI says, this is an ideology.